Thanks, Sean. Yeah, a whole 4 minutes to sit here and look at each other.
Good afternoon, good morning, or whatever time of the day there is where you are. This is Oblivious HTTP BOF. Let's get started.
This is the note well. Hopefully you've seen it by this point in the week. It summarizes your responsibilities and rights in IPR contributions. You should take a look and dive into some of those links. Make sure you're up to speed. Alexia, would you like to go through the agenda?
Yeah, so we have note takers. People are aware of Note Well. This session is being recorded on Miteco. I think we settled that. So agenda is roughly going to be half an hour. Martin will talk through use cases and technology recap. Then we'll have a walk through the charter. Any comments, any discussions on the currently proposed charter. And if we realize that people are happy with this work to be chartered and the charter looks good, or there are only minor changes that we can take offline, then there might be some time at the end to do on specific issues on the documents. But obviously that conditional on the rest of the BOF being successful.
But before we move on, any bashes, proposed changes to this agenda? All right, hearing none. Just a quick review of the process history here. Martin published this Oblivious HTTP draft back in January. And we had a discussion in the Sec Dispatch Working Group in March this year, the last IETF meeting. That discussion resulted in a new spin out a new working group to do this, as is one of the Sec Dispatch outcomes. So our Sec ADs went ahead and put forward a charter. We're working it through the IESG process, and while it was being reviewed there at the IESG, there was some, they went out for comments on the OHTTP mailing list, and there were some concerns expressed there that led to some concerns being adopted by a few of the different ADs that filed block positions. And so the point of our BOF today is to kind of work through some of these concerns and see if we can convince those ADs to unblock us and move forward and get kind of clearer, better agreement across the community. So with that, I believe we are over to Martin for the technical overview to get us all back up to speed on what we're talking about here. So Martin.
I've requested access to the slide thing.
Richard, I think you need to stop sharing first before.
Okay, it stopped.
Then one of the chairs needs to approve Martin's request by clicking on it.
Yeah.
That worked. Look at that. So these are mostly repackaged slides from the last meeting that we had in Sec Dispatch. By the sounds of things, quite a number of people here have not seen these, so I will go through them relatively quickly. There's a little bit of new material in here as well. So what is this? It is the ability to make unlinkable HTTP requests. That involves having a proxy to hide source address information and mix requests together. That'll give us a little bit of traffic analysis resistance. And of course, encryption so that the proxy can't see and modify the things that are being sent via it. Pretty straightforward arrangement. Client encapsulates the request, sends it to the proxy, which forwards it on to the server. And the server just removes the encryption layer, manages the request and sends a response, which is also encapsulated in a very similar fashion. The crypto is a little bit uneven, but the basic principles pretty straightforward. So this really gets to a lot of the questions that we're talking about here, and people will want to know more about what we have here, and I think we'll probably want to discuss that a little bit later. But the basic scenarios that we have in mind, at least, is we control clients, control to some extent, we control servers, but we don't really want to have the information that clients might be providing to those servers be provided in such a way that the information can be built up into profiles of individuals, particularly when it comes to things like DNS, and particularly when it comes to things that are moderately sensitive along the lines of things like telemetry, where over time, the accumulation of information about a single individual might lead to us being able to gain more information than we'd really want or need. One of the ideas behind this is that this has less overhead than some of the alternatives. You can achieve similar properties by using a regular HTTP proxy and just making a new request, a new connection for every request. That costs a lot. And you'll also know that Tor has similar sorts of properties to a proxy, but with higher overheads. And then, of course, once we get into things that are truly sensitive, and we're talking about some of those things in the advertising space right now, you want to go into things that are far more sophisticated and far more privacy preserving, with k-anonymity goals that are mathematically verifiable and things like that. And so then we go into things like PRIO and the new heavy hitters protocols that we might be talking about in the near future, I hope. So there's lots of reasons that you might not want to do this. I don't think this is not reasons not to standardize, with enough negatives there that I hope people understand, but just reasons that you wouldn't want to use this sort of mechanism for your particular use case. This doesn't work for general purpose HTTP. It's obviously more expensive than a direct request. There's a bunch of crypto, and there's really, it's stitching two requests together, so there's multiple connections and forwarding and all sorts of other things. And there is some amount of trust involved in this system. And so if you have higher requirements on your security and less trust, then you might want to use something that's a little stronger along the lines of Tor. So the most natural comparison here is to one request per connection. And this design trades some things, replay protection, post-compromise security, and protocol changes, primarily, for some amount of performance. So you can see the comparison here shows that there's no signing and verification involved, which is a modest improvement. Lawless hashing, which is basically nothing, but probably from our perspective, the main thing is that we're talking about shaving this down to one round trip rather than two round trips, and that makes a huge performance difference. Of course, if that performance difference doesn't matter to you, then this doesn't really suit, but this will drive the cost down significantly. So the draft goes into this into a lot more detail, but the basic idea is that there is some limited amount of trust in the proxy from both client and server. So both sides need to trust it at least to some degree. The client trusts the proxy not to leak their identity to the server. It's pretty straightforward. And from the server perspective, it's a little more complicated because the proxy has to basically be responsible for a lot of the denial of service functions that servers would normally perform themselves. One of the things that servers will likely see in this case is a lot of requests coming from the same proxy. And generally speaking, servers would deny those sorts of requests from an individual client. And so they have to sort of trust that the proxy is genuinely forwarding from individual clients and not being used to mask denial of service attacks against it. There's some discussion in the draft about traffic analysis and what might be done to deal with that. That's a difficult problem that all parties involved take some responsibility for. And there's also a discussion about replay attacks and the implications of there. But that's something that we have some experience with in TLS and HTTP already. This uses a new message format. It doesn't necessarily have to, aside from the fact that message HTTP is not very good. But that's something that we should probably talk about in chartering. This is a discussion that we didn't really get into at the SecDispatch meeting. but it certainly has a bearing on where this work ends up. I won't talk about this too much more. So one of the questions that has been raised on the list is with respect to those authorized TLS interception scenarios where clients in particular are configured with trust anchors, and those enable the use of interception in enterprise networks, for instance. And there was a concern raised that this was deliberately trying to circumvent those sorts of interception policies that might be applied. And that's actually deliberately not the case. I can say that we definitely have no plans to do that. We don't even enable DOE when interception is enabled, and we have no plans to enable this when we're not using, when the devices are configured to enable interception at all. That is independent of whether interception is actually in use. If we think that there's a chance that something is going to be intercepted, we don't generally try to interfere with that. And so there's some discussion that I've added. There's a pull request. The slides have a link to that you can click on, but there's a response to that there. I'll also note that the draft ensures that requests are identifiable using the media type and a combination of other things, if you like, which should make them identifiable in case this occurs accidentally, but that's not expected to be a primary mechanism. Most cases where interception is enabled, you simply don't want to use this sort of mechanism because it is directly counteracting the interception choice. And the other thing that's been raised that I have a little more trouble with is this question, which is, does this make consolidation worse, or could it? The funny thing is, part of the motivation for this was to ensure that if we use this for DOE, we don't provide DNS resolvers with a large concentration of information about user requests. One of the ways in which information is exploited is by taking a longitudinal study of individuals' DNS queries, and this breaks the stream of DNS queries up into individual queries. There is obviously some potential to connect them based on the content of those queries, but the protocol would provide nothing that would allow them to be connected at the protocol level. And that is, I think, reducing the concentration of information in these servers. And there are other things, obviously, here that are probably more important than that when it comes to questions of consolidation. And I don't know how far we want to get into the rabbit hole of talking about market pressures and all those sorts of other things. But there are some design choices here that would be interesting to discuss along those lines, particularly as it comes to things like the relationship between the proxies and the request targets, the different resources involved. And this is just the summary slide. I am done with presentation.
Any clarifying questions about the presentation itself? Benjamin?
If the Ben Schwartz, Google, if the applicability of this is driven by latency considerations, why is telemetry on your list, or how is telemetry latency sensitive?
So it will depend on the application, but the telemetry case is primarily modified by simply the cost of submission. The cost of submission under a per connection thing increases fairly significantly relative to this design. That's all. There's no latency consideration for telemetry, but there are other things where latency would be interesting. There's a bunch of things that the server that browsers in particular talk to servers for. Those were just the two that I put on the slides originally.
Okay.
Tommy?
Yeah, just to comment a little bit on the use case and latency requirements that Ben was referring to. I think the other kind of canonical one I've heard referred to besides DNS is something more like the safe browsing checks that a lot of browsers currently do to Google servers and others, because that is something that can be done in a user load, so it is very latency sensitive, but it's just looking up kind of this universal resource that we don't want tracked. So maybe that's a better example than telemetry.
Right. So the reason I didn't include that originally is that that already uses some form of PIR, but your opinion may differ from mine on how that that PIR is actually effective. So this may be applicable there. Yes.
Richard?
Personally, my opinion is that PIR has enough caveats that it could benefit from a mechanism like this. But the question I came to Mike to ask is about kind of the caveats this needed. So you noted that this is not suitable for generic HTTP, which has a whole bunch of state tracking mechanisms attached to it. I was just wondering, whether it's your assessment that the set of things that you need to turn off about general HTTP is sort of consolidated enough that we can describe the applicability of this thing clearly enough to give implementers a clear guide as to what they need to, what sort of box they need to put around this thing to make sure that it's not leaking unduly.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there are a number of cases where use of HTTP is fairly constrained. We're not talking about the web browsing case generally. We are talking about things where HTTP is used for APIs and that sort of thing. And in those contexts, I think you have a lot better ability to understand what sort of information is transferring between requests or transferring from the context into the request. And so I think we have some guidance there. And of course, we could probably improve on the guidance in the draft.
Okay, Eka?
So I think this may be more a clarifying comment than a clarifying question, but just reading the chat, I think it's really important to make this point. This cannot be used for generic web browsing, not because it doesn't carry cookies, but because you have to modify every server in the world that supports it. And so we already have a thing, which is a proxy system for talking to generic web browsers, and it's called MASC. And by the way, HTTP Connect. So what this is for is something entirely different. What this is for APIs, where there's a pre-arrangement between the client and the server, and not and where the client is some way of getting the server's key material. So I guess to people who are concerned this will break generic web browsing applications, it's not suitable for that. And so things like content negotiation or localization just are not relevant in this case. I'm not saying there are no cases where you might want to know where the thing came from or something like that, but those are cases where the proxy got to tell you or the client got to tell you. And so it's just not it's there's just no way to turn this on for a generic client and how to do anything useful at all.
Thank you. Mark?
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. I don't know why it keeps on popping up the permissions dialog. That's really weird. But if I say need echo 3 times, never mind. I think I said this in the mailing list discussion, but I would very much like us to carefully consider what we call this thing. For the record, I'm supportive of this. I think these are interesting use cases, and I think that leveraging HTTP for this use case is generally a good idea because you're getting so much reuse out of the bits that matter. But it's causing confusion in this room. I'm pretty sure it's going to cause confusion to developers as well if you call it something HTTP. So I'm not saying we shouldn't, but I think we need to very carefully consider what we call this protocol, which I know is something that historically the IETF is not very good at doing.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Richard?
I just thought one more thing. Since some of the comments on on the mailing list, and some discussion around this has been about kind of impact on network operations. Martin, I wonder if you could just comment a little bit on how this, if it were used for a given API, would change the traffic profile of that API. It seems like sort of like it would mainly on the client side just change it so that the requests would go to the proxy instead of directly to the server. But I was wondering if there's some subtlety there I'm missing.
No, it is pretty straightforward in that regard. So clients that have an API endpoint that they are configured, or they might be, I hesitate to say this word, they might be discovering that endpoint somehow. They would switch the server destination for the proxy URI. And then the other modification is that they encapsulate before they send, which adds a handful of bytes to every request. So that's really the only sort of modifications that you're talking about. So it should be relatively straightforward to shim in the additional protection.
Mark, did you want to talk again? No. Christopher?
Wondering if there are any use cases for which it would be helpful to amortize setting up an HPKE context across multiple requests, or will it always make sense to always generate a fresh encapsulated key for each request you make?
Yeah, so at the point that you're sharing state between requests, you're not really doing this at all, and you're better off probably just making new connections for that.
Jana?
Hi, thanks for the presentation, Martin. I want to I was thinking about the use cases for this, and perhaps you can help me by articulating some of those. Going back to something that Eker said, which is this is not for general web browsing. No, those are not your words, his, but it seems to resonate with me. I'm trying to understand what the actual use cases are. I mean, you're characterizing the use cases as ones where you don't want to have state shared between requests. Basically, you don't want to have a connection because you don't want to have state across requests. What are those use cases, one, and how does one, how does an implementer figure out when to actually use this thing? I don't even know what to call it yet, but that's a separate question.
So we've talked about DNS, telemetry submission, safe browsing. The things that are most interesting to me are things that have latency requirements in the order of 1 round trip, and have some amount of private information associated with making the request or the content of the request. But they have no structural need for anything to be linked between multiple requests. DNS is perfect for this, but there are other examples that obviously fall from it.
I guess, I'm sorry, just to follow through on that, is assuming that 0RTT and Quick are not good enough for this, right?
Well, so the problem with 0RTT is that you have linkability between the original query and the subsequent one. So what this effectively does is it provides the functionality of 0RTT without the cost.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Martin, can I comment quickly on that?
Sure.
Just to follow up, Jana, if you had something for TLS or Quick that was like a prime public key that you could use for 0RTT, that would be kind of similar to this particular design, wherein the client has a public key that's shared by potentially many other clients, rather than a point-to-point or one-to-one state that's shared between a client and the particular server. But we just don't have that.
Can I jump in the queue here, Chris? I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't want to jump in. So that's an interesting point you make. Is that a plausible solution to the problem? Actually having a shared public key for a particular domain that is made publicly available that
It
clients
very
can
well
use?
might be.
Okay.
Yeah, it very well might be. But this is, I think, arguably simpler in terms of like the actual mechanics that need to happen.
Right. No, my concern was I mean the cost, of course, in terms of not a cost, but a big hurdle to this is you need to get all the servers to actually start deploying the scheme.
Exactly.
And that's a pretty big hurdle for deployment, right?
It does raise the bar, yes.
Okay.
But you'd also, whatever this, hypothetical, extension to TLS or Quick or whatever, that would also be, additional code that someone would need to write. So it is a difference. I'm not sure it's a substantial distinction though.
Yeah, so keep in mind that we don't need to change all the servers, just those that operate these API endpoints that we're interested in hitting in this way.
Of course. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so the queue is closed after Tommy. Then we'll move off to the charter. So Andrew next.
Hi, yeah, thank you. 2 points. One which ironically has just come up in the Jabber chat as well, which is I really think the use cases and ideally use case limitations need to be documented somewhere. And that will really help give better clarity to the proposal. Either that or bring into sharper focus whether there is a genuine use case here, one or the other, which would be positive. And also, and I'm sure we'll come back to this point later, but since I think consolidation was mentioned on the slide, I just wanted to make the point now to revisit later that without discovery, I think there really is a risk of that if we let clients decide which proxies and servers to use without any input from users or any choice, then there's an absolute risk of centralization of traffic, and that seems to me like a really bad a bad approach that should be avoided at all costs. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
So I'm relaying a question from Stephen Farrell here. Sorry, I'm just scrolling back to find it. I believe the question was, this is premised on the client having an HPKE for HPKE key, public key for the server that it can use to encapsulate requests. And what's the current theory for how the client gets configured with that HPKE key?
Another hard question. I see a lot of people saying +1 discovery in the channel. I don't know what the +1 discovery actually means in this context. There are a great many hazards when you start down the path of building a discovery system. You have to decide who to trust with providing that information and how that information is provided, and you have to deal with some of the key consistency issues that I think Chris and I have a separate draft talking about. One of the initial deployments that we're talking about here simply relies on configuration for this sort of thing. So to give a concrete example, we would ship in Firefox a public key for the server that we were expected to talk to, and the URI for the proxy that queries would be sent to, and that would be fixed. And we'd have reasonable certainty then that individual people weren't being targeted using the key, and we would have some trust relationship with the proxy. That's a fairly straightforward deployment mechanism, and I expect that there would be a number of systems that would benefit from being able to do that sort of thing. Talking about discovery means that we're then into other interesting deployment models, and I know those far less well. And I think that's a much longer discussion to be having. I don't want to have the ADD discussion here as well.
Tommy? Mark, the queue is closed, unless it's really important.
I just wanted to go back to one of the points brought up earlier when John and Chris were talking about comparison to using 0RTT. I think the properties are slightly different when you're using Oblivious messages compared to a lot of 0RTT end-to-end connections. So right now for our private relay service, we use Go, which is essentially the same properties as this. And I think it is very important to note that when you're using the Oblivious messages, the proxy can reuse kind of one big pipe of HTTP 2 or HTTP 3 to the target and forward many, many different messages over that, as opposed to having to bring up a bunch of new sockets, essentially TCP or UDP, between the proxy and the target. So it's a lot lighter weight for the proxy as far as reuse, and also potentially allows it to make the messages look a lot more consistent as far as timing in that channel.
All right, thank you. I think we are moving on to the next section now. Actually, we're just about on time.
Martin, I think you need to relinquish the presentation slot so that I can take it back over. Okay. So we're going to go into the proposed charter review. So this is the charter that was on the list. We've cut it into 3 slides. I'll page through it briefly so that people can kind of swap it in, and then we can have some pretty open discussion about what folks think should be in the charter. So we cut it into 3 chunks. First chunk is kind of the problem statement here, which I think captures broadly what Martin described in terms of trying to protect some aspects of client identity, such as source IP addresses, from servers that offer HTTP APIs. So this is kind of the context setting. The second slice here is describing what the main work product of the group would be. In particular, the Oblivious HTTP protocol, which, as we were discussing a moment ago, might deserve a better, nicer name, as Mark suggests. But it gets the principle here that the idea is to encapsulate HTTP requests so that they can be, they can provide these privacy properties with low latency via proxying these encapsulated requests and responses. There's also an applicability statement called for in the second half that will try and capture some of the many constraints that we have been discussing here. Okay. Third part of the charter here is the usual litany of caveats that the working group will focus on the core elements as in advance of any other work, and will liaise with other relevant groups. So HTTP for HTTP aspects, CFRG for any cryptographic aspects and things. There are no milestones that have been specified in the charter yet, but I think Martin said on the mailing list that then obviously the major milestone would be the core protocol, and Martin suggested about 1.5 years out from the formation of the working group. So that is the charter as it has been discussed on the list so far. With that, I think we have quite a bit of time set aside for discussion of whether this charter makes sense, whether it has the right scope, what should be in or out. So I would appreciate it. I think Alexa's going to manage the queue, but I very much appreciate folks keeping their comments focused on what should go in this charter, how we should scope this work, and whether there is a well-defined problem here to be solved, and whether the problem is clearly understood and clearly scoped. So with that, let's open the queue.
Mark, go.
Once permissions again, can you hear me?
Yep.
Very consent focused. So like I said before, I support the formation here. I think that as I understand the set of use cases, this is interesting. As you can probably tell, what I'm most concerned about is any potential impact on the rest of the HTTP ecosystem. And so I think that the work would need to very carefully consider how it is related to that, in that, as I understand it, Martin, you're defining a new HTTP application effectively. You know, there's a URI that you send these messages to, and I look at that in terms of BC56 bits and how that does things. And the really interesting part of it is it also encapsulates HTTP messages into this new protocol-ish thing. So I don't have any answers for that. I think you could maybe recast as an extension, or maybe it's fine like it is. Something that should be in scope for the working group to figure out what the best way to make sure that this slots into the HP ecosystem so that it clearly says what it is and doesn't, you know, because you're reusing the registries, because you're reusing a lot of the concepts. I just want to be careful about that. And I think you're flexible on that from the discussions I've had with you on that, Martin, but I just want to make sure that, you know, at least from my perspective, this should all be in scope for discussion in the working group.
I think
And the
all of
name.
these things are
And the
open.
name.
Yeah, we've talked about making this a little more generically extensible, and I have some design ideas. I just haven't implemented them, and I want to implement them and write the specs at the same time. So
after my initial comments, actually, I'm kind of coming to a place where if we can define use cases that this is good for, I'm actually okay if it isn't that generic. You know, if it's a specific tool for a specific kind of task and that's well defined, that's great. Maybe it shouldn't be more generic, but let's have that discussion in the working group, I reckon.
sure, yeah, good point.
Thank you, Mark. Elliot?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Martin, for the presentation. My comment is more about I'm a little more concerned about the use cases, one in particular than the mechanism. I think most of the mechanism we can hash out in a working group. That's, to me, not an issue, including the issue that I raised about proxies. I don't see that as a blocking issue, at least in my mind. The concern I have, and I'd like Martin, if you could respond to this just a little bit, is in the use case for DNS. I'm somewhat nervous about. Here's the question, really. If you have bots that start using the Oblivious HTTP servers for CNC, what is the operational method to determine who those bots are and how to shut them down? Currently, you can go back to, you can trace them back to at least a server, but a name server, if nothing else, and say, okay, the name server can then sort them out. But what do you see as the operational path for tackling these issues?
So that's going to depend very much on your deployment model. How are you deploying your CNC detection at the moment? So in a lot of cases, I understand that this happens at resolvers, and they look at the query stream that's coming in, and they look for abnormalities in that query stream, and then investigate those things. In cases where an entirely new name suddenly pops up and has a large amount of traffic or prefixes and whatnot, and that sort of thing is done at the resolver and could be done at the resolver under this sort of regime equally. The only thing that this would sort of prevent is those cases where you're using inferences that rely on the connection between queries by the same client, and I'm not sure that that's something that necessarily fits in with that sort of defense mechanism at all. But I don't know enough about it to understand fully.
Okay, if I may just follow up for just 30 seconds. I think the issue here is, will the resolver, in particular I'm thinking about the DOE resolver, have sufficient information to identify the source in order to say, hey, that's, you know, this guy's, you know, a bot, let me inform someone about it. Right? The bots are they're pretty clear to identify, you know, in these resolvers. It's not that hard. There's a lot of code that does it. Maybe they'll get sneakier over time, but they're not that sneaky right now.
Yeah, well, when you take steps to deliberately ensure that someone can't identify your source IP address, then they don't get source IP address. That's kind of a design feature.
Right,
So
or above, depending
you
on
have
how
to
you
make your
look
own
at it.
determination. Yeah, well, you have to make your own determination about whether or not this is something that you want to have deployed in your applications.
All right, Magnus?
Yes. If I understand this correctly, there's a linkage here between, so saying the encapsulate, what we can send safely within the encapsulated HTTP request and what that doesn't leak information is a limitation towards the possible supported use cases here, in addition to what the other properties of the mechanism. So what I'm missing a bit from the charter or from the work seems like is the clarity, and that you actually maybe have to write something about what is in the encapsulated HTTP request and what do you need to form those so that they are not leaking information themselves, and how that interact with the applications and use cases that's intended to be supported here.
So I've had this comment from a few people. I'd just like to say, if people want to make this comment, this is great input to a working group. I don't think this is the sort of thing that charters need to address.
But okay, let's clarify that. I can't see from the charter that that question at all is in scope of the charter or for the working group. I'm so wrongly interpreting the charter.
I consider that firmly in scope of applicability statements, and there's language in the charter on that.
Okay. I guess that's, if you're saying it in scope, maybe we look at see if more people agree on that. But yeah, it's good.
Benjamin?
Ben Schwartz, Google. I wanted to ask about the question of whether this problem is clearly defined. As I think about these use cases, I think that the really important question here is who trusts who? Like, who trusts who about what? And there are a lot of parties here, and there are a lot of trust relationship types. I'd like to see that spelled out a little more. I find it very challenging to explain when this is valuable, especially if we put discovery out of scope and say that we're just talking about essentially hard-coded configurations. In that case, there's a single party who has chosen both the proxy and the FAR destination, which is a little bizarre because that party could have just chosen one server that they actually trust not to track the user instead of trying to pick two. And it's even trickier because those two servers can't really be strangers to each other. At a minimum, the destination needs to specifically approve each proxy that comes to it, because those proxies are going to deliver enormous volumes of traffic if they're legitimate. And so an illegitimate proxy could deliver an enormous volume of abuse instead. So we end up with this situation where we need these two parties not to collaborate, but we do sort of need them to coordinate. And it just seems vastly more complicated to me than a solution where you instead pick one server that you actually trust and talk to. I'm not saying this is insurmountable, but I'd like to see this at least acknowledged in the charter, maybe with a deliverable.
So,
Can you clarify what the deliverable would be?
I think the deliverable would be a very precise description of the trust relationships and assumptions. Who are the parties, and what are all of the assumptions that they have to make about each other's relationships? Because the client here needs to make an assumption about the nature of the relationship between two other parties, and it actually can't ever prove that. It just kind of has to hope that it's true. So I'd like to see that spelled out. Ideally in the charter, if we already know what it is and it's short enough, and then we can judge whether it's realistic enough to be worth chartering, or we can just move ahead and make sure that we write it down for the implementers at some point.
Okay, thank you. Eric?
Yes. One thing that I feel strongly needs to be in scope for such a working group, but it's not clear to me is in scope in the current charter, is communication of encryption keys. Now, in an attempt to differentiate this from the more contentious sides of discovery, I'm talking about the case where the client has somehow already picked the proxy and the target server it wants to use, and it just needs to be able to get the key from the target server, whether it's HPKE in the currently defined mechanisms or something else defined by the working group. But I think it's important to be able to do this, have a mechanism to do this communication, because otherwise we're really going to paint all the clients and servers in the corner where they're essentially just coming up with an IETF style protocol and half agreeing on each other to use it together. And that's really the case of, we need this for this to be useful for a lot of the potential use cases. And like I said, it's not clear to me this is currently in the charter. There's something about, I think it's slide 2 had like the format of encryption keys, but I think communication of encryption keys also needs to be in scope, because I think it's a very important part for this theme.
And I think we've done charters quickly, but if you think that things could be made more explicit, then make that clearer. There are significant challenges in building a system like that, so it might not be the core protocol that we're talking about, but sorry, I don't have it on the screen that I can refer to, but there's text in the charter about deployment and supporting deployment models with discovery and other things. This is part of it.
So so I can't, it sounds like you're saying maybe not part of the core protocol. And I agree, it doesn't necessarily need to be part of the core protocol, but certainly needs to be part of the core in scope for the working group to work on. Maybe a separate RFC from the main protocol RFC, but I think from the beginning it needs to be in scope for the working group.
Thank you. Tommy?
Yeah, so to start off to chime in, I definitely support this charter as the right starting place for this work, and I think we should do it. I wanted to make 2 points here. One, to what Elliot was saying earlier about bots and fraud detection. I think when you look at a model like this, detecting bots kind of expands in responsibility from just the DNS server to also including the proxy. So, in the way that we are currently using Oblivious DO, a lot of the limitations on who can access this and the bot detection and fraud detection is happening in the proxy itself, not within the target alone. And so I think if you're distributing the work in order to improve privacy, you also need to distribute the responsibility to validate traffic and improve trust. So I think thinking along those lines would help for this, and not saying that the things behind proxies are still responsible for everything they were before. These are boxes that are coordinating, not things that are just randomly put together. Then to some of the broader concerns, I think it sounds like a lot of these concerns are pointing to questions for deployment model, specifically deployment model of proxies with the Oblivious targets. I agree that this is a larger question about how you set up trust relationships, how you do discovery, and these are important things. I think that is work that should be done in the IETF overall, but I think it's bigger than this one topic. It's not just here. We see some of the same people, interested parties showing up in multiple groups and multiple topics here. So I feel like it'd be a bit incorrect to try to shove all of the work about how do we set up these trust relationships about who can proxy, how do we do discovery, because building a mechanism just for this particular protocol of Oblivious HTTP, I think would be the wrong result. It almost sounds like we're going to need some type of ops working group for this in general. That would encompass long-term how we deploy Oblivious HTTP, how we deploy DOE, maybe how we deploy Mask going forward. These are things that are going to be a broader question. And we don't need to solve it all here, even if we have a dependency on some of those solutions long-term.
David?
Yes. Oh, well, I guess there are no slides. My face is really big on the screen. So I'll start off by saying +1, I agree with everything Tommy just said. But one thing I wanted to focus on is use cases here. I'm hearing some folks talk about discovery and centralization, and that doesn't match the use cases I have in mind for this completely, like, at all. So this, in my understanding, and the proponents can tell me if I'm wrong, but this is absolutely not for general web browsing. If you want to proxy your web browsing, we have another working group that can do that for you. This is for very specialized cases where you're already, as a client, knowing that you're talking to a given server, and you want to give less information to that given server. So, for example, on Chrome, something that's really important is safe browsing. So what's safe browsing? It's not the act of browsing. It is a service where you say, hey, is this origin safe, or is this one known to use malware? Another example is TLS certificate revocation. You can ask a centralized authority, like, hey, is this certificate revoked? If that authority is something you trust, so as Chrome, these are going to be Google servers. Like, no matter what happens in this working group, we're talking to the same thing. What this gets us is that this allows Chrome to provide the Google servers with less information, because now they see, okay, someone asked whether this TLS cert was revoked, but they can't build a profile of David asked these 4 sites in a row. And that's where this has a lot of value, but also there is really no point for this use cases of having discovery, because at the end of the day, if Chrome wants to do this to be able to talk to a Google server, probably it'll have a contractual agreement with someone to operate, with a third party to operate this HTTP proxy, so that we can't collude. That contract is going to involve, dollar signs. And so we're not going to discover and say, oh, someone offered to do this, we'll send it to you. No, we're going to use the one that we actually decided to use. So that's why I see this technology as very useful. I would like to see it move forward, but I don't think we need to bog ourselves down in things like discovery, because they're absolutely not needed. And this is a really hard problem that I think we could completely face plant if we tried to solve. Thanks.
Thank you. Zahed?
Hi, I hope you can hear me. I looked into the current charter text, and I think the applicability statement that addresses a number of my comments that I had on the previous version of this charter. Having said that, I think still I'm a bit not sure about the use cases we're talking about, because it seems like people have different things in mind. I have seen some people are confused, so maybe we can do a better job on what exactly or give some examples of the use cases that we're talking about here. Also, the charter text currently says like this in this context, and also later on, so that this working group may work on a different use cases. So these things need to be a bit clarified for me. And I would like to echo what Mark Nottingham said. Like, I am fine with this work to be very specific to the particular use cases and not it to be very generalized, but that's up for discussion. But having said that, I think this is something that might be useful, and we should work on it.
Do you think we need to clarify use cases in the charter, or can we do this in the working group?
Yeah, I think would be good. Would be good to give an example. Say like a lot of charters have examples. Like I think we have been discussing a lot of use cases here. A number of use cases we can give it as an example. But if this charter also says like, yeah, we're going to work on use cases, that is good enough.
Okay, thank you. Jonathan?
Hi. So I'm going to relay something from Stephen, and then I'm also going to add my own comment if that's okay. So Stephen wrote, we have Tor, albeit we don't have a way to standardize Tor in practice. Are we better off standardizing these point solutions or aiming for a more generic Tor-like scheme that has broader applicability? Okay, and then my second one, my comment would be anonymity and privacy are different things, and Tor is providing anonymity, and OHTTP is providing privacy, and specifically does not give any protection against a global passive adversary.
I think Martin's mic is having issues, so I'll reply, I think, to the first one. That is like, what about Tor and something general? As Ecker pointed out earlier in one of his comments, we have that. That is what mask is. That is what generic HTTP Connect is. So it's not clear to me that we need to do yet another generic thing for that particular use case. On the second point, yes. Assuming an all-powerful, omnipotent adversary, the privacy and security guarantees that you get from this particular type of deployment are in fact limited. The threat model here is a bit more constrained than that of this global passive observer or eavesdropper who can see everything. So, and it's not clear to me that we need to, raise the bar to that of a global passive adversary. So, my 2 cents. I don't know if Martin wants to chime in via text or not, but.
Okay, thank you. Yari?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to make 3 points, or maybe 4. The first point being that I like this work and this should go forward. So whatever comments I may have, it's more about the charter than the, whether this should be done. It should definitely be done. So the first point is about the use case. We already discussed that a little bit. I think more clarification that would be useful, potentially even in the charters, though I'm not sure that's actually required, but somewhere more information is needed. And if we think about the DNS use case, for instance, I think there's some question marks, at least in my mind, about exactly what, because you can do some of these things that we do for DNS and Oblivious DNS and other things. It's not the only possible solution for reducing information. Confidential computing has also been explored by my team, for instance. So I think there's some clarity there would be useful. So please work on that a little bit more. And the context is not there yet quite. The other comment is sort of related to what Magnus was saying earlier about the requests, and I think it is a lot of fun for us to work on sort of the plumbing part of things, but the payload is also quite important. If you look at the general internet, I realize this is not for the general internet use cases or general browsing cases, but the problem usually not in the framing of things, but actually what you send inside, and you can send lots of stuff. You can do fingerprinting, and I think it would serve a lot of purposes if we actually provided some advice on that as well. I think that's a thing that we should say in the charter. And a third point is that I think we do need to look at discovery, and I think. Yeah, I mean, of course, it needs to be in the context of whatever the application is and the use cases are. But I think it would be unfortunate if the answer is that we can only have one thing, and this isn't really more generally applicable, or cannot have multiple parties and so forth. Of course, you can't push a proxy function to a sort of random device in the internet either. But I think something along the lines of, here's a trusted party that should approve the kinds of proxies that we are willing to use, and then the actual set of proxies could be dynamically discovered. Something like that might actually work without causing too much headache. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Yari. Vittorio?
So my fundamental problem with the charter at this stage is that well, the proponent's answer to many people's concerns is that your concerns are avoiding the intended use cases, but still the use cases aren't really spelled out, and they seem to be a moving target. So if this is only for private use by a specific application like Firefox telemetry, then it's fine. Even if I don't really see the privacy advantage of, requests go to a contracted party rather than just go directly, since there is still an element of trust. But this is an analysis that we can document. But on the other hand, if the use cases include DOF, for example, then I have no doubt that this should support discovery for the same problems that have led to establishing ADD. Maybe it's the same discovery mechanism that it will be defined by ADD. Maybe it's a different one, but we have actually the same issues. So, I think that the use cases seem to be identified as we proceed and as people come up with new concerns, which is fine since we are still at a brainstorming stage, basically. But I think that this really needs to settle down before we can proceed and finalize the charter and establish a working group. So we should spell out the presumed use cases and also the use cases that we rule out. Like, since the problem that many have is what happens if this is used for general browsing, then we need to spell out that this is not meant to be used for general browsing. And when we agree on the use cases, then we can have a discussion whether we need to have discovery, whether it should be discussed in this group or somewhere else. I'm fine if if we recognize a broader need for discovery in general or for trust relationships and key management in general, and we want to address it somewhere else. But still, we need to make sure that it is addressed somewhere if we need to address it. And in any case, my concern is that no matter what we say in a charter or in the document, in the specification in the end, if this protocol is technically usable, it is possible to use it for general browsing, then someone will use it for general browsing. We've seen this with DOF. You can state expected use cases, but people will just go beyond that if it is technically possible. So, either we mandate the group to make that impossible because the protocol should have technical features that make it impossible to use this for general browsing or for use cases that are not the intended ones. Or on the other hand, we have to explore the consequences and the possible impact on everyone, on all the network communities and all the stakeholders. And so at least include a discussion of what happens if the protocol is used beyond the expected use cases. And then, whether we want to go beyond that and to which extent it's within the mandate of the IETF, then it's also a discussion we can have, but at least we have to start the analysis and come up with the possible scenarios about what could go wrong. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrew?
Hi. Yes, this will follow quite nicely on from what Jari and Vittorio just said, as it happens. So looking at the charter, I think it's missing 3 key milestones and obviously, therefore, the work to underpin those. There's an absolute requirement early on, if this charter proceeds, in a milestone, which is to produce the use cases and use case limitations document, and for that to be published by the working group. I think even from this discussion, it's really clear that that's a very obvious need to be added to the charter. Secondly, again, so picking up on some of the points in the Jabber chat and being made on the mic, I think there really needs to be a document produced that looks at some of the operational and security concerns involving a broad range of stakeholders. Effectively looking at things like, and I'm pulling out a couple of things on the Jabber chat. This is really reliant on non-collusion between the server and proxy for there to be any form of added privacy. How is that going to be verified? It certainly needs to consider the potential negative impact on centralization and also things like the potential sort of security exposure if it's exploited for CNC by malware, even if that's not an intended use. So I think, yeah, it's nice to have the use cases, but we've got to be realistic of permissionless innovation will apply here, whether we like it or not. So that needs to be thought about as well. And then finally, again, alongside the protocol, the workgroup absolutely must produce something documenting a fair discovery mechanism, so that there's a way of an open method to discover proxies and servers that will be supporting this protocol. If it's possible to repurpose something being done elsewhere, such as ADD, fantastic. I don't really see that that's true, because ADD isn't doing a general purpose discovery method. So absent a general purpose discovery, I'm sorry, but one has to be included in the charter here. Otherwise, this is not this working group won't actually deliver the whole job, and it's simply leaving the work for somebody else to do later. And I think that's lazy and inappropriate. Thank you.
And Drew, could you just, if I could just ask for a brief clarification, you seem to really believe that discovery protocol is necessary. Could you comment on why you think that there's such a critical need for a discovery protocol?
Yeah, absolutely. As I see it, frankly, this goes back to trust. If I'm a user, and RFC 8890, I think is pretty clear here, why should I just trust that the client software is making the right, valid choices for me? Why shouldn't I have the ability to choose different proxies if I wish? Which avoid centralization, which I think is a creeping concern. Otherwise we might just as well give up and say the internet becomes a network of CDNs, and that seems like a really bad outcome for users. So I'd almost turn it on its head and say, why wouldn't you want discovery? Justify why not rather than justify why. My stance is we should have this discovery. And is needed here, and I can think of no good reason why not.
Right. Thank you, Ecker.
Well, I've been in the line a long time, so I have some notes. The first thing is just to echo what Tommy said. I'm strongly supportive of this work. This is useful work, and it's something which like we already have a number of people who have a real need for. Second point I'd like to make is I'm finding this whole discussion of discovery and general purpose web browsing and how all that we bow really quite surprising. We have a working group which is specified to do non-discoverable general purpose encrypted web browsing. It's called MASK. And so all the people who think that is bad to do OHTTP, I don't understand where were you when we started MASK? And everything that people and if we don't have OHTTP, what people will do is we will use MASK, or we'll use HTTP connector, which is one of those things, which will have isomorphic properties to OHTTP, but will simply have inferior round trip and cryptographic properties. So to the extent to which people think that this general concept of proxying the data between the client and the server, and having the proxy obscure the IP address of the client, and and be part of that trust boundary is a bad idea. That ship sailed back when we shipped HTTP Connect years and years and years ago. So I can understand people might be concerned about those things, but that ship has sailed. Yes, Ben, thank you. Just show IPsec as well, but HTTP Connect predates IPsec, I think. To the specific question of discovery, I guess my question for the people who think discovery would be good would be under what circumstances is that going to actually work? As David pointed out, the major use cases for this are ones in which the client is selecting both the proxy and the target. And in those cases, the person who wrote the client knows the people they trust, and they know the people that are potential proxies, the people potential targets, and they're for them to allow a random entity on the network to advertise as their proxy is that completely defeats the privacy purpose of the protocol. So, I think it's certainly possible, a client would allow, someone to configure their own proxy. That doesn't seem problematic, but that's not discovery, that's configuration, it's something quite different. And so I guess the people I think want discovery, I think it's really incumbent on them to describe an actual use application where a discovery of this type, where someone might actually want to use this and thinks that actually is considering it and would find discovery useful. Because if you can't, then I just don't think this is a reasonable thing to insist on as having part of the protocol. Like you want to like have the working group charter just to have it in a non-blocking fashion as the charter currently has, totally reasonable. But to have it be like a condition of deployment when the people who want to deploy it don't care about it, it just doesn't make any sense. Finally, I think I wanted to address this point that I think a number of people made about the trust scenario. Certainly it's true that to build a system like this, what you're doing is you're saying, I need to trust the proxy and the endpoint, right? And as Ben pointed out, if there was some way to be like, I absolutely trust the endpoint completely, then this protocol has no value. But in our experience, what happens is that people are a little uncomfortable with the idea that there's a purely policy control that guarantees that one endpoint is trusted. And so the purpose of a system like this, as in many multi-party computation systems, is such as, for instance, PRIO or heavy hitters, or many of the two-party PIR systems, is designed in a situation in which you have to, or Tor for that matter, in which you have to just trust more than one person, and they have to collude in order to attack you. Now, is that like a perfect guarantee? It is not, but it's a better guarantee than saying that you want to trust one person. I think. I guess I said the last thing, but I should have one more thing, which is, Yari, you mentioned confidential computing. I don't know exactly what specifically you're talking about, but I'm actually fairly familiar with the techniques that people are thinking of using. For example, replacing DNS or replacing safe browsing. There's a Henry Corgan Gibbs paper on something called Checklist, and the performance properties are actually not like as good as what you get something like this. But they're very impressive work. And more importantly, they're not generic techniques, they're specific techniques. So, the question is not like, can we, for any specific application, maybe have a PIR technique that works? It's that we have a generic solution for providing this kind of multi-party trust for a variety of different use cases. And the answer to that, unfortunately, is no. If the answer were yes, I'd be much less enthusiastic about this work.
Thank you, Ekar. Ed?
Hi, Ted Hardy, coming to you from UTC 1. Sorry if I'm a little bit less than perfectly coherent, is it? I wanted to make a couple of points first around the charter. And I think during the chat exchanges, we've actually seen a framing that it would be very useful to bring into the charter. I think there's some of it in the draft, but it's quite clear that the framing in the chat has been, this is about building HTTP applications in which a server wishes to provide a mechanism to allow blinded queries to reach it through cooperating proxies. And the use cases that people are talking about are actually the individual HTTP applications which use this set of procedures, some of which is protocol mechanisms, some of which are going to be individual key management issues, and some of which are going to be the agreements between the service provider and the blinding proxies. And I think having that in the charter as the context setting is really going to be helpful when we bring the charter out to the wide audience for final approval, because I think the current charter has those breadcrumbs if you've been following the conversation very tightly, but maybe doesn't have them in ways that's clear enough for those who are coming to just read the charter and not the framing discussions that have happened. I also think that as a result of that, you probably want to lose the name completely. And we've had a lovely bike shed painting contest in the chat that you can mine for other names, some of which are silly and some of which might actually be useful. But I think that by recasting that, that would be useful. And I think one of the pieces that shows you is that most of this discussion, as Ekar says, about discovery is just missing the mark of what this is meant to do in the common case, right? If you look at the discussion in the chat around Google's safe browsing service or a map tile delivery service or the Firefox telemetry service, in each of those cases, there's a single service provider who's going to make the agreement with the blinding proxy, who's going to distribute the information about it. And the consolidation and discovery issues that people keep getting wrapped around don't really change with the fact that you have taken what was a single service and split it into two parts, which allows you to have the final delivery service be blind to exactly which of the clients made the query, which is the aim here. So I really think that by maybe going up a couple extra 10,000 feet in writing the start of the charter, that we could possibly make it a little bit more obvious why those things shouldn't be the starting focus, even if there do happen to be a few services, and DOE is the obvious one here, where because it is a global service, there might actually be, how do I find one of the many proxies that have been set up, proxy services that have been set up. So I think those aren't the obvious places to start. You start with the one where there's single service providers, and you show how it works in 2 or 3 of those, and then you tackle the one where there's a global scope and see if the same things work there. So once again, I think this is a useful and interesting piece of work. I think the generalization of it has maybe taken a turn that's been misunderstood, because I think it really is about how each one of these services builds HTTP applications which accomplishes these goals, rather than creating an overall generic browsing mechanism or an overall generic proxying mechanism. Thanks.
Thank you. We just closed the queue after Tommy Jensen. So sorry, Thomas. With that, Andrew.
Hi, yeah, so also coming to you from 1 a.m., so apologies, this is a bit incoherent. But so following on somewhat from what Ted said about how this isn't a generic mechanism, I just wanted to sort of back up some of the comments that were made, I think mostly in the chat, about how clarifying what the use cases are is just so important in that case. Both so you know what you're actually getting, but also from a security point of view, which I don't think has been mentioned so far. I know the draft mentions replay attacks at the moment. So I think documenting exactly when this can be used incredibly clearly and what the downsides are if this is used in other cases is just going to be so vital to stop people interpreting this as a more general protocol. And I think sort of relatedly to that, there's been a lot of discussion about consolidation and discovery, and I'm not going to weigh into that discussion. But I think given that there's been such a lively discussion in this group among people who are sort of invested in this, I think really documenting exactly why those concerns are not valid for the use cases that are defined for this protocol is going to be really valuable. Because if people in this group aren't entirely sure why or why not these are not or are concerns, then I don't think anyone deploying this protocol is going to have a clue. So I think, personally, I think separate sort of milestones for the group for these documents would be helpful, like a separate applicability statement rather than just a document mentioned in the charter, but actually sort of published with the eventual protocol document. But I think both of those will be really helpful in actually helping people deploy this securely. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph.
Yeah, so just to echo some of what the previous person said, I think it is important that we kind of outline what the security properties are that we're going for, since it's a little bit different than maybe some of the other security mechanisms that we've been looking at. And, you know, defining threat model and things like that will be somewhat important here. So either having that described in the charter or as an explicit milestone, I think would be a good idea. Thanks.
Thank you. Eric?
Oops, I need to actually allow permissions to use my microphone. The plus one to what a bunch of people said, I like the way Ted Hardy framed this earlier, and that I think a bunch of the confusion here perhaps points to areas where it could really help to clarify the charter text and put some use cases in it. I think on the discovery side, I think another one against discovery is that it seems likely for some of the use cases that we're most talking about is that in order to prevent some of the abuse that may happen, it's likely that proxy and server is going to need to employ some type of authentication. So maybe in the long term, as we start looking at other use cases, We could look at discovery, but I think that's almost a counter a counter use case or a counter goal in the beginning. I think on the charter text, one thing I think that might be helpful to call out explicitly is that the property where the bulk of TLS key signings is handled by the proxy and where servers have a smaller pool of bundled connections is by itself interesting enough that may be worth calling out in the charter, as there are a number of use cases that might get unlocked just by that once they get up to large enough scale. And I'll also give a big +1 to Mark Nottingham's suggestion earlier on that we really need a better name here. And I think that we'll want to think carefully about the naming here from how it looks from a public policy perspective and a marketing perspective as how will ISPs and governments respond. There's already enough sensitivity there related to things like DOE that just how we name this may make a big difference in terms of whether they get scared by this or whether they ignore it.
Thank you, Jana.
Thank you. I think I'm audible. Okay, good. I got the mic line yesterday, I think. So I tried to keep notes, but I've been scratching and rewriting, and so I have no idea. But I'm going to say the core points I wanted to say. This discussion has been very useful, so thank you for it. And Martin, thank you for the draft. It was a good read, but having the draft out doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's got it in their cache. So the discussion is definitely incredibly helpful here. I'll start off by saying I think I'm in support of doing this. This is a good piece of work, and I think it's useful. I don't think it captures all the use cases. This is repeating what everybody already knows, so I'm not going to talk about that. In terms of use cases, I think that it has been articulated. I think what would be helpful, and this is not for the charter, this is for later, for implementers to understand exactly how to think about when to use this and when not. Finally, on discovery. Actually, before getting to discovery, I will say that I thought that OHTTP was actually a good name for this, because I think it actually captures technically exactly what it does, and it captures it well. However, I'll take Mark and Eric's points that there might be other non-technical considerations why OHTTP may not be helpful in getting this deployed. So to that extent, I think it might be interesting to reconsider the name, but otherwise I think the name is actually pretty good. It captures what it does quite well. On the discovery point, coming back to discovery, because everybody's been talking about that. It is not something, configuration should be included as a way that people deploy stuff. We do that all the time. We don't always just go and discover things on the internet. Not everything works like that. Many things are configured, pre-configured, and that is a real way of deploying things. And not being able to have the technology to deploy at all makes it fundamentally impossible to do it, even with configuration. So I'll take Tommy's point and repeat it, because I think it's actually a good point, and it certainly made me reconsider my thinking on discovery here. Was basically that we have several pieces of technology that we are building, not just in this particular meeting, but at the IETF. Mask is one example of that, and which right now have no discovery mechanisms. That we don't have any discovery mechanisms for them, and each of these is going to have different hurdles, but it's quite fine to build the core technology that we want to build here without actually having a discovery mechanism for it. I certainly don't see it as something that blocks us from deploying something like OHTTP or Mask for that matter. So if we want to make a more general, if we want to have a more general conversation around discovery, let's do that, but let's not make that a necessity for this working group, which is clearly the charter is not talking about that, and the charter is not asking for that, and I think it's perfectly reasonable without that. So I'll say that the onus is on those who want to insert discovery into the charter to demonstrate that it is necessary. So I don't think that anybody needs to demonstrate that discovery is not required. We deploy things right now without discovery willy-nilly, and that's fine.
Thank you, Mark.
Permissions. There we go. Okay. I'm here for you, Yari, and Lars. I agree with Ted's comments that a little bit of reframing could help this quite a bit. Regarding the discovery issue, I agree with Jonah's statement. The onus is on the people who are asking for it. I will point out yet again, HTTP does not have a discovery mechanism. Although this protocol is different than HTTP in some respects, it is also very similar. And indeed, the discovery mechanisms that are the informal discovery mechanisms that are defined for HTTP are quite problematic from a number of different aspects. So discovery is not a magical solve for consolidation issues. You know, consolidation on the web is caused by factors that are way, way, way up from this in the stack from, oh, I need to find a local proxy or I need to find a server-side proxy. And so in fact, you know, done badly, I think discovery is going to add a lot of bad aspects to the protocol in terms of allowing the network or other folks on the path to insert themselves upon the user in a fairly forceful fashion. So yeah, clearly discovery is a requirement, is a no-go. I'm happy to talk about it with folks more, but I'm extremely skeptical.
Yeah, I also think there was really a lot of useful information in the comments being made, you know, especially from Eric, although the speed with 300 words per minute was overflowing me. So I'd really love to see more than what I usually get from these working groups in terms of an explanation document. I'm not sure if it's use cases or system reference model or, you know, scenarios, but all those things that were discussed here kind of nicely comprehensively written in a document that's not just, you know, way below the line in how it would read in the current charter, right? May work on, yeah, we really don't care. We just want to do the protocol specification. Nothing against that, but it would really be good to have documentation coming out of the working group that would allow as many as possible people to understand the systematic implications and comparison with the other, you know, solutions that were mentioned here in this call.
Just agreeing with Yari and Ted to some extent here. I do think one of the things that is wrong here in the charter is that there really wasn't a really good description of what the use cases are. And I think the converse is true as well, that there wasn't a really crisp description of what the non-use cases were. And I think that's important in the charter. I know that there is an attempt in 3.1 of the draft to actually talk about applicability, but I think we've seen today, and we've seen in this hour and a half so far, that the confusion over what the use cases are and what some of the non-use cases are is something that really needs to be clarified. And so I think from a practical point of view, the fifth paragraph of the charter is just too weak. It just doesn't say enough. And so that needs to get fixed before the charter can go forward. I agree with the previous speaker. I think a crisp problem statement that was a separate milestone might be a useful thing here so that we're not overloading the protocol document, the actual core protocol, with a whole bunch of text about what the use cases are and aren't, and warnings to implementers and so on and so forth. And maybe separating that out into a document that would reach implementers would be a positive thing. My last comment is also in paragraph 5 of the charter. There's this last sentence about operational considerations. And when we can reconsider the fifth paragraph here of the charter, I hope that there is more text there that describes exactly how the operational considerations are going to be reflected in the protocol design. There are often times that we miss that, right? That we either don't include that or we don't describe the process by which we took into account operational questions or operational issues for new protocols. And I hope that in the fifth paragraph or whatever replaces it, we do a little stronger job of talking about how we're actually going to do that.
Thank you. Watson?
Apologies for stepping in a bit late, so forgive me if I repeat something that I already said. I wanted a version of this protocol in 2016. I didn't realize or 2015, I didn't realize that was the protocol I needed. There have always been applications where I've wanted some way for a client to send something to a server and the server to be unable to link that to other requests the client has made. It's an extremely important thing for a lot of privacy enhancing technology. And we really need that in order to increase the degree of privacy people have on the web. These are very sort of limited seeming use cases, but things like telemetry, et cetera, very important to have that additional privacy. I really want to push back on saying, okay, we need discovery, we need to get all these stakeholders. The whole point of internet innovation is you don't, right? We have the protocol, it solves real problems. That should be enough to deploy it. And for ISPs, especially, you're moving packets. You're not supposed to care about what's in them. That's sort of the way this whole thing's architected. And so when it comes to operational considerations on networks, it seems like the argument is that, well, I should be able to get insight into what's flowing over the wire. And no, you're not supposed to get that insight. To the extent that you are able to get that insight, we've identified that as a problem because there is no difference between a consumer ISP, some entity on the network that you have no idea exists, somebody's compromised Wi-Fi endpoint. They all have the same power on the network. There's no way to distinguish. We design protocols to treat them all the same and prevent interference. We do that regularly.
Tommy?
So again, yeah, been in queue for a while. Going back to Ted's point earlier, plus 100 to what he was saying, I think setting the context about the fact that this is building HTTP applications with cooperating servers and proxies really, really help here. And again, to reiterate on the discovery point, I want to encourage people who are talking about that to think of this more like how users interact on a system with a VPN. There isn't an open discovery protocol for any random IPsec VPN endpoint. That would be an absolutely crazy model. And that doesn't mean that this cannot be a very, very valid protocol that is very useful to users for different applications. And absolutely, when this is deployed, we should let people configure which proxies, which service targets, what they want to get. And already for the use cases that we have described here, safe browsing or DNS, these are things that have their own models for how users configure them, turn them on and off. Whether or not we're adding these privacy protections probably will become part of that. It's just like how people can install VPN apps or choose to configure the system VPN. But again, we don't randomly send people through things that are discovered, and that would not help privacy at all. That would not help user choice at all. Let's talk about configuration, not discovery here. And I think it's also critical to understand that the deployment model and the configuration model depends on the specific application. So, to be clear, people have brought up ADD for DNS. I would love to use the ADD discovery mechanism to discover ODO or like OHTTP target keys that are being used for DNS. That makes sense in that application world. But there are lots of other use cases that we could have, like safe browsing, etc. And those aren't all going to have the same configuration mechanisms. So trying to say that there needs to be a generic configuration or discovery mechanism is incorrect here. That needs to be specific to the applications. And yes, we can say we need one for DNS, but that's different from saying we need it for anything that is using this particular cryptographic mechanism to protect messages.
Sure. Tommy, you get the honor of final closing.
Yeah, sorry, I think I jumped in there.
I didn't turn my microphone on. Sorry about. I don't think the sky's falling here. I think if we put some introductory text, as Ted suggested, to say what's in and out, is good. I think that what we're falling into here is the trap where we try to put everything in the charter. I do not think we need to do that. I think when we're talking about use cases, again, we can put some examples. The applicability statement that's listed in paragraph 5 covers most of the rest of that. People wanted to talk about, what are the usage constraints? That's already there. I mean, again, we need to talk about operational considerations, but how we're going to address that, deeply within the protocol and put that in the charter, I think is just totally not useful. I think we just have to leave it to the authors and trust that the working group will end up delivering a product that will actually meet its needs. Thanks. All right, thank you. Tommy?
And so that me now, Tommy Jensen, Microsoft. A lot of comparisons have been brought up with the ADD working group, and having spent a lot of time there, I'd like to draw a comparison as to why I do not think the discovery argument applies here, and in fact is quite the opposite. So in ADD, the problem we're trying to solve is when a network recommends a server insecurely, we want to make sure that we end up bootstrapped into a server securely that was colluding. Collusion was actually the goal. We want to end up with an encrypted communication with an endpoint that is colluding with the prior endpoint so that we don't send our traffic elsewhere. This scenario is exactly the opposite. I want, as the client developer, to have my software choose a proxy that is not colluding with the target destination. I don't think that the charter needs much change. As people have said, I don't think listing specific use cases is great for a charter. I do think it might help if we do want to highlight very specifically that the scenarios being targeted are those where ahead of runtime, we know the destination, meaning that I intend to use this protocol to these 5 destinations or whatever for very specific purposes, because outlining that then highlights why we don't need discovery. I know where the target is, and since I know the target and therefore I should know who owns it, I am also best suited ahead of runtime to pick a proxy or a set of proxies that I know do not collude, or at least that I am confident do not collude. And I certainly wouldn't want runtime signals interfering with that decision, right? That would just make it worse, potentially.
All right, thanks for that, Tommy. And thanks to everyone for your contributions to this. I think this has been a useful discussion to many folks. I think folks have come away with this with a clearer idea. I hope a clearer idea of what's being proposed here. And I think we've gotten some useful suggestions for how to refine things. So Alexia and I have been back channeling a bit in the background and just kind of wanted to present our summary of where we see things having ended up here. So I've got a few high order points here. A few things on which the charter could be clearer. It seems like folks would find it useful to have a few clear use cases mentioned in this, not stuffing everything in the charter, but having a few clear, precise use cases to really capture the intent of this protocol. Second point to be clearer on, being clear on some of the use case limitations. Again, to be fully fleshed out in something like an applicability statement, but highlight some of those the key points in the charter. Third thing to be clear on, the trust model, calling out what relationships are expected among the entities, this kind of coordinate but not collude model. Calling that out a bit more clearly, with a bit more detail in the charter, I think would be helpful, and kind of address some of the points of that have been cleared up in this discussion. Finally, on this discovery question, clearly we've had both opinions on both sides of this question here. Assessment of the chairs is that there's not really consensus for any sort of requirement here. There's some folks who are quite keen on it, but there's also some compelling arguments that discovery is not necessary. So net of all that, it doesn't sound like there's very broad agreements that discovery needs to get covered in this charter. So I think that's kind of the summary that we had from the chair's side. I think Alexia was going to run a quick straw poll to capture a bit more concrete out here. Alexia, did you want to run that?
Right. Richard and I would like to ask a quite generic question about, is there a problem to be solved here in IETF that the IETF should work on? So I will start the poll and hopefully I can figure out how to use it. Just give me a second. Yes, please respond to the poll.
I think you cut it a little soon.
So yeah, did you just end the poll?
Oh,
by accident, yeah.
did I? Sorry, it's
started over.
There are
You
lots
did,
of
and when
windows
you're
I was trying to minimize, so let's do it again.
And for clarity,
Only
raising
the
your hand.
fastest will be counted.
Yeah. Does raising my hand mean I'm in favor? Wait.
Something else canceled it. I'm not sure what.
Cut the poll again.
Oh, I actually think I may have canceled it, so I will not click anything this.
Okay. One more time.
Okay.
Start session.
And raising your hand means you think there is a problem, right?
Yes, you want to work on it.
Yes.
Okay. Don't raise hand is, you know, you don't think it's a good idea or you need more information or whatever. Okay, I will give it 5 more seconds. Numbers don't seem to be going up. 3, 2, 1. Fine. So, well, it looks like enough people are interested in this space to continue working on this and trying to refine the charter. And so this is encouraging. I don't think we can ask any other more specific questions at this point. So we'll ask our sponsoring AD to say final
Alexei,
words. Yeah.
Sorry, Alexei. There's a lot of people who've not raised their hand, and it's not insignificant. I'd be curious to know what happened there, or why people think that there is no problem here, because that's not the sense I got in the room at all, and I'm certainly curious.
Yeah, I think we can maybe allow, since we're a bit ahead on time, we can maybe allow a couple minutes for that. If there's anyone who was in that do not raise hand camp that wanted to come to the mic and say why they think there's not something we worked on here.
Sounds good.
All right, sounds like there's no volunteers. Actually, while we're soliciting volunteers, Elliot.
Thanks, Richard. Wow, this has been quite the meeting. I was sort of middle of the road on this, and the reason is mostly that it's not clear to me that the general mechanism is needed if there are really going to be a small number of actors using it, and maybe, you know, it wasn't clear to me that this should be started as a standard protocol, but maybe something a little bit more. I don't want to use the word experimental, but something where you get a little bit more operational experience. And it's not like I strongly object. It's just that. You know, I just don't know. It seems almost a little too bespoke, but at least for its intentions in terms of the number of players that are actually going to use it.
Thanks, Elliot. Andrew?
Just echoing a couple of comments in the chat. Is it worth asking the opposing a question? Just to try and see if there are people that think that it is a problem that shouldn't be worked on. Not the same as not raising hand.
My co-chair may contradict me here, but I think it was pretty clear. The binary was pretty clear on the first one. So I'm going to let that stand. While we're soliciting folks, I would like to ask to the floor Zahed or Rob Wilton or Eric Bink, the folks who are holding blocks on this, to see if they have any last questions here, things, any remaining concerns that they had that may not have been addressed yet in this discussion.
Rob?
Yeah, Rob, please go ahead.
Yes, so I thought it's been a very useful and very interesting discussion. I don't really have much to add or say that hasn't been covered by other people here. I think for me, describing the use cases is particularly helpful, and I can't remember who mentioned it, the idea of having a separate problem description document sounded like that would potentially be useful when people come to understand us deploy this. Having that separate from the protocol spec sounded useful to me. I did also agree, I liked Ted's comments that he made about trying to set out the sort of big picture would be particularly useful. And the other thing that I picked out in terms of what was said here was that I thought that describing the sort of trust relationships between the clients and the server and the proxies, I think that is useful to explain and understand what those relationships are. I have to say, some of the use cases, I didn't find some of them that compelling in terms of how they'd be deployed. So again, I think better descriptions for that would be helpful. On the question of discovery, again, just listening to what was said there, it felt to me that discovery probably isn't required and potentially could even be harmful. So my preference would be not to include it initially and maybe investigate to see if it's helpful. But that was just what I heard in that conversation. But thank you everyone for participating in this BOF.
Thank you. Zahed?
Yes, I think Rob just said what I wanted to say. I think still the use case, my comments on the use case still holds a bit clarification on some sort of way of like describing it would be helpful. And I also heard that I also think like there could be one more like clarifying the applicability statement, what is included and what is the point of the something along the line Ted was saying would be helpful. And with that, I think I'm happy what happened today here, and I think this is fine. I'll clear my block. I think after the discussion what I went through here. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. Eric, you're the last one outstanding. Anything from your side?
I think Eric wrote in the chat a little bit ago.
Okay.
He can't speak, but he needs to see an improved charter on the domain limit. Accent server needs to be modified, and Ted Hardy's context and clarification in the charter, if possible, about the trust among partners, and that Echo replied to many of these points.
Great. So Francesca, then over to you as our sponsoring ED to wrap things up.
Yes. So first of all, thank you all for the really good discussion. It was really useful, in my opinion, and thanks to you, Richard and Alexei, to accepting to chairing this BOF. It was a very well-run meeting. Yeah, it's been useful to identify the issues and that you, Richard, have summarized. And I also wanted to ask if any of you have proposed text, practical text to modifying the charter. I think it would be great to have that suggestion in the mailing list. Yeah, that's it. I hope to see you participate in the OHTTP mailing list, and yeah, we will figure out the name. But yeah, see you there in the meantime. And thank you.
All right. With that, I think we are adjourned. I think we've got some good action items going forward to revise this charter and get it back up to the ASG for consideration. Thanks to everyone for your help on this, and we'll see you on the mailing list.
Thank you all.